Okay, hello everyone. I'm Dionysus, or David. Dionysus is just what I go by online, and today I'm going to be talking about probably something a bit different than most staking conversations, and I hope you find it exciting and useful. It's about making Ethereum visible. Has anyone here heard of the Delian problem by any chance? Okay, so the Delian problem was back in ancient Greece in the town of Delos. There was a plague going on. And they went to, as they do in these ancient times, they went to the Oracle of Delos and they were like, yo, how do we not die from this plague? And the Oracle was like, you need to double the size of the altar of Apollo. And they were like, okay, how the heck do we do that? Back in those times, they had straight edges and compasses. So basically, they could draw lines and they could make circles and angles and stuff. This was Euclidean geometry. And it turns out that it's really difficult to double the size of a cube. And they just couldn't do it with a straight edge and a ruler. So the intuition that I want to give you is that the tools that we use make our reality visible. And in a kind of weird way, math isn't even real in some sense. It's just a measurement of reality that help us achieve certain things. So there's this quote I like by this Spanish architect, Antoni Gaudí. There are no straight lines or sharp corners in nature. The Delian problem is basically that we're able to, if we have new tools, such as the Cartesian plane, you can actually map you can actually see cube roots. So you can't see cube roots with just a straight edge and a ruler. So what I'm going to be talking about is cognitive tools. This is another one just to kind of drive the point home. At least in quantum field theory, there is a notion of there being these underlying quantum fields that basically influence how particles work in our universe. And Feynman diagrams actually describe how some of these particles work. They describe something that's actually invisible, and I'll get to how Ethereum is invisible in a sense too, and how we measure Ethereum. But they describe something that's invisible, and they make it visible through this diagram. And if you don't use a diagram like this, you end up having to see this whole thing as what's called a path integral, and it's basically this really complicated math, and it's okay, what does it even mean? So these Feynman diagrams just make it easier to understand behavior about an invisible world. So TLDR, cognitive tools help us understand and change our world. If we want things in our world, we want to double the size of a cube because we don't want to die from a plague, or we want to do something in Ethereum, we have to look at the tools that we have, right? Our rulers, our measurements, our Cartesian planes, math, things like that. So we build and measure Ethereum with cognitive tools. On the engineering side, our cognitive tools are pretty good. We use a lot of math, we use a lot of mechanism design, but on the social side, they kind of suck. And I'll talk about more of the social layer of Ethereum and how home stakers really embody what I'll refer to as the spirit of Ethereum. So one more example of a tool is a miscalibrated compass. So this is really kind of a tragic condition that I want to highlight. Imagine you want to go somewhere, right? In the same way that the people of Delos wanted to double the size of an altar because they literally just didn't want to die and they believe what this oracle said. So let's say you're a traveler and you want to reach the illuminated city and you have a compass. So you say, okay, you know that the illuminated city is north, so you follow the compass north, but it turns out that your compass is actually miscalibrated and what you thought is north is actually northeast. Well, in that case, it's tragic because you are trying to approach something noble, and your whole epistemic reality of what you want to do and how you measure your world tries to take you to this illuminated path, but because your compass is miscalibrated, you end up going the wrong way. And this can happen in the way that we measure and learn about Ethereum too. So cognitive tools make the invisible world visible, measurable, and importantly, actionable. With these cognitive tools, we're actually able to change and engineer our world. So one point I want to drive home is that Ethereum manufactures anti-fragile civilizational substrate. So basically, there's two sides of what give Ethereum this hardness that we're able to build civilizational infrastructure. One of them is on the protocol side, where we do a lot of mechanism design and we figure out, okay, what is the right way to build incentives so that there is we have these hard properties like censorship resistance, security, and things like that. there's another side of hardness that I want to talk to, again, which is like on this social side, and to a large degree is controlled by stakers who ultimately control the fork choice. So here's this new thing that I guess the ETH Panda Ops team put out. The people are talking about this like new lab visualization, where you can see all of the all the nodes decentralized around the globe, right? And this is awesome. And one thing you'll notice, which is interesting, that people in like cryptography or like mechanism designers always talk about, is they want to disintermediate control so that control goes down to the user, right? They want to say, oh, we want control to be with the user in a biometric sense, in the sense that, oh, I scan my face and that uses a private key to give my intent and you verify a signature and that's me. Or I give a fingerprint. Or I burn some calories and I touch a screen and say, okay, sign this transaction and do this thing, right? So we like to look at systems and we say, okay, when we try to distribute keys, distribute signing keys throughout the network, we want to give those keys to actual users and humans that are bounded by like this cognitive human layer. But what's interesting that I'll say about this diagram is that like even though you have distribution of the signing key of the participants in the validator set, which are signing attestations, proposing blocks, and things like that, there actually is a cognition layer that is arguably not decentralized, where, for example, let's just say, like, there is some huge campaign that goes around on Twitter that's like, oh, we need to 10x the gas limit, like, today. Like, for some reason, everyone thinks that we just have to do that, and they're, like, really strong arguments, right? Like, even though your signing key is, like, distributed, and theoretically everyone has their own reasoning, and it's relatively pluralistic and decentralized, it's easy to convince a large amount of the network to say, okay, let's actually do this change, and in a sense it has some centralization. So one thing that I want to hit home here is that the protocol kind of purchases human reasoning as a way to manufacture anti-fragility in terms of this like substrate we build for civilizational infrastructure. So yeah, let's just get right into it and look at some cognitive tools in Ethereum. The first ones are like social feeds. So we use like X, Farcaster, things like that in order to measure the world in the same way we use like the Greeks used rulers to like measure sides of cubes and things, right? We're like, okay, this is the state of the world, this is how things are, this is how we learn about the world. And we primarily use that through social feeds. And these have different types of algorithms that show you about the world and with different incentives. So the cognitive tools we have kind of suck, but there is promise of things getting better. Again, we have like ETH Magicians, ETH Research. This is like synchronous human deliberation with text. We have Farcaster. Again, it's a text-based feed for you to understand the world, and you can also propagate sentiment throughout the network. We use math, podcasts, and then there's this really cool tool that the protocol support team has, which is called Fortcast. Fortcast is this new tool, which is like basically takes the all core devs process and has some new tooling built on top of it, new cognitive tools actually. So one cognitive tool is like you take the abstraction of like an all core devs call, right? And it might be a complicated thing because you don't understand all of the details of the protocol and all the mechanisms involved with it. But if you have like a TLDR summary from an LLM, especially an LLM that's tuned to your preferences in the way that you understand the world, you have a new cognitive tool for understanding how Ethereum works. Another cognitive tool is like over here on the right. This is basically a hierarchical segregation of priority between EIPs, right? So it uses color coding for you to understand which things are relatively more important, and like things like S, A, B, C, and D to like kind of weight things between each other. I'll give another example. There's a project called Deep Funding in the Ethereum ecosystem, where basically we're trying to like figure out what is the relative value of a bunch of different repos inside of the ecosystem. So for example, we kind of found out that like it's hard for a human being to figure out like how valuable a single thing is in isolation, but it's a lot easier for a human to take two things, compare them against each other, and measure them with a multiplier. So for example, it might be hard to say, okay, like, you want all of these percentages to add up to 100% or the number 1, right? In terms of like capital allocation on like what's a good idea. And you can easily think of these repos as like EIPs in some format, or things that you want to promote within the ecosystem and think are valuable. It's hard in isolation to say, oh yeah, like the ETH Panda Ops, like the Helm charts is like worth like 3% or something, right? It's like how do you come up with that, right? But it's a lot easier for someone to say, oh, comparing these two, like which one is more valuable and by how much? So this is a cognitive tool, right? It allows us to measure the world better, produce better data, and allows us to actually engineer better solutions for a world that we want to go towards. This is another thing called Polis. It's a policy selection mechanism that is similar to the rough consensus algorithm we use in all core devs. The basic idea is that you have a bunch of statements. People agree on them, disagree on them, or pass. You take data about all of these people, and you plot them in like multi-dimensional space, and you cluster them actually, right? So people have dimensions and features, and then people are all of these rows in a database. And if you can plot them in multi-dimensional space, you can kind of have clusters and you can have groups. So you could say, for example, that there's like, I don't know, 6 or 7 kind of clustered groups in Ethereum based off of certain properties, right? And what rough consensus does, and also this Polis policy selection mechanism does, is they say, we're gonna reject any policy that doesn't meet a certain threshold of each group within the ecosystem, right? And it turns out that policies that use this like bridged consensus algorithm overall have better like agreeability in the group than ones that use something like majority voting. Like majority voting usually ends up looking something like this, where just a huge group of actors in your ecosystem don't actually agree with the policy, and that causes all kinds of social issues. Open Agora is one other cognitive tool that I worked on with some people in the open source space. It's a tool that like kind of utilizes Polis and tries to think about how we can, we were actually thinking about this when there was all this like EOF debacle going on, like a very sensitive issue, because people worked on it for a long time, and we wanted to see like, okay, how can we like measure how people feel about this and like whether or not it's a good or bad idea for Ethereum. So, this is one way that you can like actually try to have a view into making something that is, kind of invisible in some sense, like, okay, how do people feel about EOF, or how do people feel about Fossil, and making that visible to a certain actor. So an actor always has a lens that they look at Ethereum and the world and the policies, and they try to measure it and figure out like what's the reality so you can act on it. So this basically uses like Polis. You can get an idea of like, okay, how much consensus are there for different issues, and I didn't show the part where there's like a voting mechanism like agree, disagree, pass, but it's like the same thing. And there's a little bit of a loaded slide, but because I just wanted to get information in there. But the basic idea is that, when we measure our world, like Ethereum, and we try to understand Ethereum, we all come from different backgrounds, and we all have different like technical understandings, different philosophies, and we can't just use one tool for like everyone, because that's just not everyone thinks the same. Some people like to read, some people like to watch videos, some people understand diagrams. I mean, everyone understands the world differently. So what's important is that you give the person who's trying to like measure the world their own tools for understanding like how things are working, right? So to give you an example, like one thing that you could do is just an example I thought of recently is like, there's recently this like trustless manifesto thing that was going around on Twitter, right? That Vitalik and some other people made. And you could say, okay, I agree with this, right? You could say, I agree with the trustless manifesto. Like this is something that I'm aligned with, right? So you could, for example, take an LLM that knows your preferences, knows that you align with the trustless manifesto, and interprets some set of things to measure the world, and it can tell you, okay, these are the impacts of this proposal based off of the values that you have. Another way to think about this is like, I'm not sure if people have like are familiar with like the issuance debate. Like I think Anders like Ellison like wrote some stuff about like issuance, and like for me like a lot of the formulas are like I just don't like understand the math and all that very well, and I'm like I just don't really like get like how changing different like parameters and the functions like actually change things that are important to me. But like, the thing is like, you don't actually, depending on the lens of what actor you are in the ecosystem, you don't need to know the details of that math. You just need to know how this impacts you. Like, for example, if you are a staker, you could say, okay, you're just gonna earn less money, right? I mean, there's gonna be there's more nuance to that, but you can see the outcomes of something without knowing all of the details, right? And LLMs are actually really good at that. Like, you can say, okay, here's this like this hard engineering thing that I don't understand. Like, what happens? Like, what is the result of changing this like complicated thing that I can like actually understand? Yeah, so the TLDR here is that, you know, Ethereum cognitive tools like kind of suck in my opinion, but they're getting better with things like Forecast, experiments like Polis, and experiments like deep funding. I think that this talk in some sense is a little bit philosophical, but that is because Ethereum is a little bit philosophical. Like, it's just new technology, right? And we have to accept that we're doing something new that hasn't really been done before. So we have to invent these new things, actually. Like, it's really a new precedent. So I think that we need to try to like invent algebra in some sense, right? In the same way that algebra and like Descartes coming up with like the Cartesian plane would have allowed the ancient Greek people to see cube roots, right? Like, we need different tools to be able to see the reality better. And the reason for that is because it'll allow us to measure the world better and engineer better solutions faster. So I think that one thing maybe I didn't hit on enough is that, like, you know, really the most aligned actor in this ecosystem, in my opinion, is the home node operator, the home staker, because they have the most alignment with the hardness of the protocol, because they earn ETH. And I think it's just really important, anyone that stakes, that it's really like a it's really like a role to be proud of, I think, and it's really impactful in the ecosystem. So I hope that we can get more stakers on Ethereum and more people that stake involved in the process of controlling the network, right? Because you run a certain binary that has the protocol rules, and you know, I think that it's very important to keep Ethereum as this like anti-fragile civilizational infrastructure. So if you want to hack on this, I'll be at ETH Global over the weekend working on cognitive tools, and we can always chit chat. I'm dionysuz.eth on all off-chain places, and dionysuz.eth everywhere on-chain. And then I also, as a shameless plug, I make an open source tool called Kitty Node, where it's like easy to like run an Ethereum node with it. So yeah, I don't know if there's time for questions, but that's my TED Talk.
We do have about time for maybe one quick question. I see one here from the audience, but looks like I'm not seeing one. Will you be around a little bit?
I will be around, yeah.
Excellent.
Okay, thank you guys.
Thank you.